Well, hello, Professor Kent Lee here. Welcome back to Intermediate Writing or Intermediate Composition. Today we're going to talk about exposition, expository paragraphs, expository writing. Well, let me give an example of where exposition maybe is not good outside of the world of writing. In literature, and you talk about movies and novels, often a beginning element is exposition. The writer or the movie maker kind of gives us some background on the characters and the scene and some background on, that we need to understand before the plot really starts to pick up. Background story, maybe there's some background about this haunted house or something like that. That's exposition, and it's usually mostly limited to the beginning of a story. Now, I'm a fan of Doctor Who, the British sci-fi show, and probably the last episode that aired was a very controversial one. A lot of Doctor Who fans hate it. You might not be familiar with Doctor Who, that's okay. Doctor Who has been running for a long time on British TV. It's had a lot of producers. The current producer, fans don't like him. He's not done a good job with the story. In the very last episode that aired, I think last year, it was called The Timeless Child, the producer basically really changed a lot of basic things about the character and her background in the story. And that's one thing that has really upset a lot of fans. And if it had been better done in the episode, maybe fans wouldn't be so angry. But it was also badly done in the episode because a big chunk of the episode, in the middle of the episode, was exposition. And you don't want that in kind of an action adventure story like you usually expect in a sci-fi story. There's this big chunk of the episode where the bad guy is explaining some crucial information that he's found out, and it cuts to kind of flashback scenes, and it goes on for a very long time in the middle of the episode. And that's just really bad production. That's something that you just usually don't do in a TV show that's supposed to be kind of action and character driven, to suddenly cut to this big chunk of exposition in the middle. Now, exposition is okay in various kinds of writing, professional and academic writing, what you do and what you read in college. It's basically explanation, and I'm going to contrast it with analytical writing in a little bit. So exposition is mainly explaining things, and we talk about professional sources. A lot of these are maybe, for example, journalists or other writers who are explaining something to us, and it's a second-hand explanation. The writers, it's not their own original ideas or contents, but they're kind of explaining it to us, the public, whether it's a book by a business expert writing about who's examining different companies or business leaders and what they did well or didn't do well, or a news journalist explaining, okay, what's happening now in England with the government and the economy in England, or the health situation in the UK, or what's this new discovery, this new scientific discovery, or this new research by somebody that's supposed to be really cool and interesting. That's exposition. They're explaining something and also giving you background information. They're explaining the research, the ideas, maybe a little bit of the theory or hypothesis behind it, background information, and of course, what's the point? Why should you care about this? Why is this interesting? So we have an example in my book, page 83. It's an example of exposition. It's an article titled "More Than the Best Medicine." So this is sort of a wordplay. There's an old English expression, laughter is the best medicine. It means for your health, a good dose of laughter, entertainment, humor is good for your health. As a preventive measure, or even when you're a little sick. I forgot to include the actual reference to this article in my book. I've had this article in my different versions of my course materials for years and years, and somehow in the process of kind of copying it over to, this course book, the reference got left out. This is by, the writer is named Small, Meredith Small. It is from a science magazine called Scientific American, and it's from the year 2000. I'll include that reference here in the video. More Than the Best Medicine from Scientific American. Scientific American is a pretty respected science news magazine. So with a really good science news magazine like Scientific American, the journalists probably have a master's degree in a relevant science field, or at least they've got the equivalent in terms of their education and experience as science journalists in the field, or maybe even a PhD occasionally. There might be a PhD writer, or even a professor who's kind of writing a guest article. And I think that's the case here. So this is Scientific American. It's been around for a long time. It has a good reputation as a professional source for science news. It's usually well written. The articles are explained well. These are science writers who can understand the research and explain it to us non-experts in a way that we can understand. So the writer, Small, Meredith Small, is reporting on research by a psychologist named Bakarovsky and her colleagues at Vanderbilt University. And Vanderbilt is kind of a small, medium liberal arts college in Nashville, Tennessee in the US. Nice place. I lived there for a short while in that area. It's a good school, by the way. I have a good psychology department. So the researchers are Bakarovsky and colleagues. The writer is Small. So the article is Small reporting the research by Bakarovsky and her colleagues. The original research probably appeared in academic research journals, maybe something like this one I've been kind of holding up before, a really full, heavy, in-depth, analysis where they present their scientific hypothesis, and they describe, they give background information about this research topic, and they do an experiment. They report in very much detail, a lot of technical detail about the experiment and the statistical analysis, the scientific analysis, and then an explanation of what it means for their hypothesis in comparison with others' findings. It would be pretty technical stuff, especially with all the statistics involved. It would be in a research journal like this, which would be hard for the average person to read and understand. This is the analysis. So the original analysis would be the researcher. It would be the original research by a professor or researchers during their study and their data analysis and their theoretical analysis. So the original analysis would be in a journal like this, and it would be original research by the people who did the experiment. Write up the article explaining their research. So something like this would be original research. It would be technical or theoretical or scholarly, very scholarly level. And it would be a primary source. It's a primary source. They did it and then they wrote about it. They're writing about their research or their ideas. That's a primary source. This would be too hard for the average person who wants to know about maybe interesting stuff in psychology. So the writer here, the science journalist, Small, is explaining it to us. Small can read the article, the journalist can read the articles, interview the researcher, the main researcher, and then tell us, explain to us, exposition. So the writer this is a secondary source. The writer is explaining to us what these researchers have done, what they found, and the researcher's analysis or interpretation of their data. So the writer, the science journalist, is explaining all of this to us along with background. So this is exposition. The science journalist is explaining background, it's explaining the issue or the topic, the research question, and explaining in very simple language very briefly what the researchers did and the researcher's analysis. So the writer is telling us about the researcher's analysis, or the researcher's interpretation, the researcher's views, the researcher's findings, and what it means for us. Why should we care? Or why might this be interesting? So let's kind of look at the article, and I have some discussion questions also at the end. Well, let's look at the structure. The introduction, what kind of information is given in the introduction? Well, it introduces the researchers and introduces the research question, what the article is about. Where did laughter come from? Why do humans laugh? No other animal does this funny thing called laughter. Why do humans do it? What's its purpose, and where did it come from? The writer also provides sort of an informal hook, kind of an informal quote from the researcher, and it's kind of an informal hook. So this is professional writing. It's got a lot of more professional language, but sometimes some more semi-formal elements like this, like in the introduction. We'll talk more about that later. It establishes a fairly semi-formal tone. It's kind of a semi-formal tone. It's professional but semi-formal because, it kind of wants to relate to the reader, get the reader's attention, and get the reader to read this and subscribe to the magazine maybe. The purposes are kind of mixed. Yeah, they want to inform the public. That's their main goal. They want to make money so they can keep doing this by selling the magazine or getting people to read it online. But it's still objective and it's professional because their main goal is not so much making money, but their main goal is to tell us, the public, about science news. And that's cool. So the structure of the article, well, after the introduction, the next two paragraphs kind of briefly summarize the experiments that the researchers did. And this is in very brief. It's a very brief, simplified description. There's no discussion of the statistics or anything like that. And some background information. Also in the intro paragraph in the first body paragraph. This background information happens to include a description of different kinds of laughs, which the researchers are interested in. And let's talk about these. Different kinds of laughs, according to the researchers. Well, one, there are sort of snorts and grunts. That's when you laugh and you sound like a pig. And basically, you don't want to do that. It kind of looks bad, unless you're on a farm. It's not good, and your friends are going to not think too highly of you, especially friends or people of the opposite gender or the opposite sex. It doesn't look good. Not a good impression. Don't do that. Next is unvoiced laughter. Unvoiced, they're not using the vocal cords. So it's kind of a silent laugh. It may be very hearty, like kind of you're rocking back and forth, but you're not really making much sound. That kind of unvoiced laugh. And they say it doesn't really get people's interest. It doesn't make you look stupid, like snorting and grunting. Then there are guffaws, and G-U-F-F-A-W, guffaw. That's like a really hearty laughter, especially men laughing with each other, ha 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 ha, kind of really deep, hearty laughter of guys together. And then there's sort of the sing-songy laugh, which is maybe more typical of women, especially in a mixed company, where it's kind of a pleasant, attractive laugh, ha ha, and it, according to this research, it kind of makes a woman seem kind of attractive, especially to the opposite sex, and even sexy or attractive, or at least socially intelligent. So the researchers, did a couple of studies with these last different kinds of studies, including showing a couple of very famous comedy scenes. One's from a comedy movie, romantic comedy, When Harry Met Sally, and then Monty Python, which is kind of British slapstick humor. I highly recommend Monty Python. except that if for Asians, they may not really understand the humor. It's a lot of satire, it's a lot of cultural humor, a lot of absurd humor, and also sarcasm. And the absurd humor, especially people from other cultures may not get. It's a different kind of humor. We Americans, we love Monty Python too, because the British are really good at absurd humor. It's just very unexpected, strange, bizarre humor, which, people in other cultures don't really understand. Then the next paragraph, they kind of talk briefly about the results, how men and women laugh differently in different social contexts, like with men with men, men with women, women with women, and so on. Then there's kind of some explanation and some background here. We're the only creatures that do laughing. And there's some background information here on the second page. Chimps, for example, you may have seen chimps smiling on TV. If a chimp smiles at you, it's not being friendly or laughing. For chimpanzees, it's a totally different thing. It means submission. It does not mean I'm happy to see you or I like you. No, it means I'm submitting to you. You're my master. I'm your servant. It's a sign of submission. It has nothing to do with humor or pleasant emotions. Chimps smile as an expression, as a sign of submission. So don't misunderstand a chimp. If he smiles at you, it means, he likes you enough that he's willing to say, you're my boss, you're my master. That's not likely to happen to most of us. So the next paragraph, then it kind of talks about, based on their experiments, how they think maybe laughter evolved in the human species, in the human race. Kind of signaling and also for social bonding. So like guys are laughing together, really hearty laughter. It's social bonding. It sends social signals like, hey, I think you're funny, I think you're cool. And between men and women, it can have that kind of function, but also maybe kind of social solidarity, like developing social bonds, and maybe even communicating, I think you're funny, I think you're smart, I think you're attractive, things like that, by laughing in a sing-songy way at someone's jokes. So it can have these kind of social functions. And then the final paragraph is kind of is a brief wrap-up. It basically talks about, well, what are the researchers going to do next? They're going to look at more complex kind of situations. And finally, there's a kind of implication, a conclusion. Next time you laugh, don't snort, don't sound cheesy, unless you want to be alone, unless you want people to stay away from you because they think that you're socially awkward. So that's the structure of a professional science news article. It's kind of typical. I picked this one because it's fairly typical. So some questions here in the book. The information in the concluding paragraph is kind of more focused on, okay, what do the researchers need to do next? There's only a little bit on implications. Okay, what does it mean for you? Hopefully through the article, the writers have just done a good job of getting your interest and showing how this is interesting. It explains human social behavior and relationships. At the end, there's a little bit of an implication. What does it mean for you? Okay, don't laugh by snorting and grunting like a socially awkward person. And so fortunately, that kind of very informal implication is very short here. It's just one sentence. If this were more of a mainstream media piece by somebody who is not so professional or scientific, a general commercial news source or something on the internet, the whole article might be trying to focus on the implications of like, oh, this is what researchers say about how you should laugh and why we laugh, how you should laugh in order to look more sexy or attractive. And that's not really the focus of the researchers. That's not why they're doing that. They're just trying to understand the human laughter socially and in terms of our evolution. So a more mainstream commercial news media source might kind of distort this by focusing too much on, oh, this is what the researchers say about how you should be more attractive, and that's not what they are saying. So a lot of commercial news sources will tend to distort, misreport science news, psychology news, health news, medical news, and things like that in ways that the researchers didn't intend. And this is just a couple of studies that are being reported on here, the researchers' studies, and you need a lot more research. So let's go through some other questions here. Of course, the article, as I've said, this is secondary information. A science reporter is telling us about research and analyses that was done by the researchers. So if you read the original article, by the researchers, that would be the primary information. That would be a primary source. But this is a secondary source. A science journalist is telling us about what somebody has written and done and published. So as a result, a lot of the details of the research itself, how they did their study, a lot of the scientific background, a lot of that is left out so that a typical person can understand. So there's a lot of detail that have to be left out in order to focus on the main point. What are the findings? What does it mean? What do they find? Or what do the researchers think? So the purpose in writing, again, it's to convey ideas. They're not necessarily trying to convince us of the researcher's interpretation, but they're certainly reporting that, saying that, and to show us that it's at least a plausible or possible interpretation. And that's one thing to be careful of. And they're just reporting on, okay, why do we laugh? So the writer is trying to inform us. What do psychologists think about why we laugh? The development of laughter in the human race. Why did it evolve? Why do we do it? What's its social function, its psychological function? So the writer's trying to inform us of some current psychological thinking on this topic. It's informative. It's not trying to necessarily persuade us, but it's reporting on it and informing us about the researcher's hypothesis. So as you can guess, the level of writing in Scientific American is pretty good usually. It's usually quite professional, quite scientifically sound. And in this article, again, they talk about the researchers' findings about how men and women laugh differently in different social environments. You can think about this yourself. Do you laugh differently in different social environments? If you're just with women, if you're just with men, if you're in a mixed group, something like that. As I said, the article is informative. It's not trying to hype it up or exaggerate. And even the kind of implication in the conclusion, the writer is very cautious just to limit it to one sentence. Don't snort. The writer is really cautious about that. The writer is careful not to kind of exaggerate or hype the article or the findings, which is what commercial news media would tend to do. More commercial, profit-driven news media would tend to do that when it's science news and health news and psychology news. My last question is the researchers attempt to, explain the origin of laughter in evolutionary terms. Do you agree with this? Do you think this makes sense to you? You actually are welcome to your own opinion because this is kind of a tricky topic. Let me give you one kind of caveat, a caution. When you're reading articles like this deals with what we call sociobiology. That is the biological evolution of human social characteristics and behavior. And it's also evolutionary psychology, the kind of evolution of human psychology, whether it's human behavior and social psychology, cognitive psychology. This kind of research is somewhat speculative. I mean, the researchers are basically examining humans today in different social situations, women only, men only, women and men together laughing at something, and trying to make their best inferences about how laughter evolved, especially by comparing it with what's the closest thing? Well, chimps smile, but for very different reasons, for showing submission. This kind of research you have to be careful of when you read it even in a science magazine, but especially if you hear of this kind of research on the internet, evolutionary psychology, sociobiology, guesses about the evolution of human behavior and the evolution of human psychology. It's somewhat speculative. We can't dig up, a person who died, people who died 100,000 years ago and ask, oh, why do you laugh? Because we can't ask those questions. We have bones, but no brain tissue. We're very limited in how we can research these topics. So these are topics that are a bit speculative. Now, most other things that you read in a good science magazine, you can usually trust. This one, the researchers I don't think that they're really wrong. It's just probably very incomplete. And it's kind of hard to say. It's hard, we don't really know. It's hard to do this. So whenever you hear about research in the news, about the evolution of human behavior, evolution of human culture, human social traits, you have to be careful. They might be right. They might just be making wild guesses. Some research in the field is not so well done. Some of it is, I think this research is probably okay, but it's just very incomplete. So be careful with that kind of research. But a lot of other kinds of research, biology, climate change, physics, you can generally be more trusting of that stuff. So I'm saying this is probably good research. It's just kind of very incomplete. The analysis or the interpretation of the researchers is probably incomplete. And it's kind of hard to say, is it right or wrong? We don't know for sure. But nonetheless, this is interesting. It's a well-done article. Now, at the very end of the article, we see the author's credentials. As I mentioned before, with a lot of newspapers online, you can click on the author's name and see what other articles and reporting he or she has done. In this case, we have the author credentials. Shows us that she knows what she's talking about. She is a anthropology professor, and so it kind of shows she has some relevant background. So she knows what she's doing in writing about this topic, writing about what these researchers have done on laughter. This person is clearly a good writer. Sometimes I like to read Psychology Today online. It's an online publication. Sometimes it's professional, sometimes it's kind of superficial. It often has some good articles about current psychology research in a way that's kind of written for people in education, psychology practice, counseling, therapy, companies, personnel management companies. Psychology Today often has good articles, often has articles that are not very good, not very professionally written. And so in that case, I would click on the link for the author's name and see what are the author's credentials. Does this person have a PhD in experience in this kind of research area or not? Or is it somebody with just a master's who's just working as a coach somewhere? So with some professional publications, you have to be careful. Like with Psychology Today, it's kind of sometimes a gray area. Okay, so that's, and then finally some transitions. Notice some of the language. The language is generally fairly professional, semi-formal. There's a picture of Monty Python. So again, this is kind of a semi-formal element, not something you would see in an academic journal. So professional writing can sometimes have some of these semi-formal elements, a picture and a caption of some pop culture reference, Monty Python picture here. Because again, they want to make it readable for the average college-educated reader, and it has to be appealing. They try to sound somewhat friendly. The writers try to be somewhat friendly and connect with the audience with maybe a hook at the beginning. At the same time, they try to be professional in their writing. So those are some features of this article that are generally semi-formal, kind of a balance between very formal elements and somewhat informal elements. In the next lecture, I'm going to start talking about analytical paragraphs, analytical examples, and there's some after this in the book. And I'll talk about those, more analytical examples, and I'm also then going to talk about models and theories and things like that, which are important things when you're reading analytical pieces. They're often done, not always, but oftentimes, especially in academic writing like this, from the standpoint of a particular model or theory or hypothesis or framework. And we need to talk about those because those are terms that are often misunderstood, especially among the general public. So we'll talk about those issues in the upcoming videos. Then I'm going to, and then in a later video, I'm going to kind of come back and kind of recap or summarize, explain more about differences between academic, professional, and popular sources in terms of the style, the content, and things like that, because it's very important to grasp this. And then in the coming weeks, we'll start into like a little bit of problem solution paragraphs, talk about the plagiarism examples that I had you do, or source use examples I had you do assignments on, and the other exercises I will have had you do. Then we'll get into case studies later on this semester. So do read this article if you haven't. It's kind of a nice article, and read the next articles in the chapter. Do read the next articles. You should read those articles before watching the lectures here. So till the next lecture, enjoy, and I'll see you soon. Goodbye.